Hello, friends. Round two of recording this video due to technical difficulties. Yeehaw. Alrighty, friends. So we are going to talk about how our experiences impact our education for this week. I will be honest, there's some heavy topics in this, so just kind of proceed with care. Make sure you're in a good headspace and you're ready for that because unfortunately, some students have some really traumatic things that they've been through. And being sensitive to that is really, really important when you are a teacher. So it's easy to assume, and I know this says teenagers, and that's my bad. That's because I'm a high school teacher and I literally think in terms of high school all the time. So while it's easy to assume that all students learn the same way, at the end of the day, we all know this is not the case because we've existed as our students, right? The way I learn might be totally different from the way someone else who is exactly my age learns. It is what it is, right? We all have different learning styles and modalities and things that work best for us. A lot of students come to school at a disadvantaged state, though. Like, for example, you might have noticed, for example, when we were looking at that Waterloo data, right, in that section on how to use the Illinois school report card, notice that consistently it was the low-income students who were performing at lower levels than their more affluent peers. So we're going to look particularly at some of the disadvantage that we as students have to work to help students overcome. I don't want to say that you can necessarily fix everything that a student has to face because that's unrealistic and you will burn yourself out trying. But knowing that your students are coming to you and some of them are struggling more than others is key for you showing grace. I've generally found that some of the most challenging students I've worked with, when I have stopped myself to consider what has happened that has got them to be in this position, even if I don't know the answer to that, just that empathetic framing really makes a difference. So, starting in early childhood, some of you might be early childhood majors. I certainly wasn't because small children freak me out. But there's a whole lot of educational decisions that parents make for their children that impact the odds of their children being successful before they even enter kindergarten, which means there's a whole lot of things that are really out of your control. But here's a couple of sad facts for you, okay? So children who are academically behind in kindergarten are more likely to stay behind for the rest of their educational years, which is terrifying, right? Preschool, students who attend preschool, this reduced the percentage of children that are repeating a grade by 15%, which sounds great. But here's a fun fact for you. Not everyone has access to preschool. So for example, I might have mentioned this in a previous unit. I can't remember now. My child actually can't attend preschool in the town that we live in because it's full and he isn't a high priority because he doesn't have the same needs as students who need it more. And I respect that, right? I am lucky because I am fortunate enough to be able to take him basically up to a neighboring pre-K. Not everybody has that luxury, though. So that's kind of a problem, right? Which is nothing compared to my friends. I have friends who have a daughter who's in pre-K, and they live up in the O'Fallon, Lebanon area, and they have to pay to send their daughter to pre-K. It's not free. They pay tuition. I mean, and again, she works in healthcare, and he has an at-home remote work job. But, like, not everybody has that luxury, right? Which is a huge problem because we know that pre-K is a great intervention for kid. Being part of pre-K lowers the rate of your chances of being put in special education by 10% because those early interventions can often fix things before they become a persistent problem. Participation in preschool increases high school graduation rates by 14%. And yet we don't have universal pre-K for everyone. I still can't fathom it. Early language skills are required during your first years of life. The more words you are exposed to, sorry, I can't talk, typically the better off your outcomes are. So reading daily to children, starting literally when they are infants, help those early language skills as well as communication, social, and literacy skills, which is nice if you're home with your children and able to read to them, and might be a little bit more challenging if you don't necessarily have access to literature. So children who are not read to daily enter kindergarten having been exposed to an estimated 290,000 less words than their peers. 2/3 of parents don't read to their children nightly, and 1/3 don't read to their children at all. And as a parent myself, I will say it is sometimes hard to read to your children nightly, okay? There are some times when my children get home and they are cranky and I'm like, we're just going to bed. Especially if we've been out late for some reason or whatever. So I'm well aware that if I, who am a huge advocate for childhood literacy, am not reading to my kids every single night, although we certainly try, and it is part of our nightly routine. There's plenty of parents who probably also aren't as well. And I know that that's important, right? But things are hard, right? So I don't want you to read any of this and go, oh my God, those parents. That's not the case here, right? Parenting is hard. It really, really is. It is the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. And it sucks because there's not the parenting sucks. I love parenting. What I'm saying is that like the stakes are so high when you're a parent, and it's just hard, right? But anywho, you will have children who potentially come to you having never been read to prior to entering kindergarten. And that does set them at a disadvantage. High quality early learning programs can kind of help it close those achievement gaps, though, right? Like, for example, I have friends who work down in Egyptian high school. Egyptian's entire school unit, I should say. And they actually have a program for little babies all the way up to 12th graders. And that's amazing, right? Because if I am a parent and I'm not able to read to my kid at night because maybe I got home late from work or maybe something didn't work out, somebody read to them during the day, right? So it can really help like bridge those gaps in so many ways. Poverty also impacts young children in a myriad of ways. Children in poverty are more likely to be born prematurely, usually because they have less access to healthcare and prenatal care that makes things easier for them. They're more likely to develop asthma. They're more likely to be exposed to lead poisoning, often because they're living in older residences. They're less likely to have safe places to play. Because, not all communities have nice playgrounds, and they're less likely to have nutritious foods to eat. Kids who experience poverty in the first years of life are 30% less likely to finish high school. So it really requires like intervention and thoughtful care for these kids to make sure that they do make it all the way through. Just because statistically speaking, they're less likely to. Poverty causes chronic stress, which impacts children's ability to learn. And children in poverty usually have less access to services that might help delays. So if a student has a language delay or a cognitive delay or a speech delay or things such as that, they generally have less access to therapists that would be able to help them overcome that delay, which means they just stay behind. Generational poverty is basically what happens when you have a family who has been in poverty across multiple generations. So like, obviously, if my husband and I were to lose our jobs today, right? We both work at the same school. Let's say that something horrible happened here and we both got laid off. We would be put into poverty, but it wouldn't necessarily be generational poverty because that's whenever a family's been in poverty for over multiple generations. So greater exposure to poverty in childhood would increase the likelihood that you remain in poverty as an adult. Children from impoverished families are twice as likely to repeat a grade and 10 times as likely to drop out of high school. Chronic absenteeism also happens more commonly in lower income areas with children who are in poverty. And a lot of times that's things that are beyond their control, right? The car breaks down and they have no way to get to school. Because actually, believe it or not, bus rides aren't guaranteed everywhere. Or for example, little brother is sick, so an older brother has to stay home and take care of him because there's no childcare. And that's often why chronic absenteeism is higher. It's not that they care about school less. Interestingly enough, multiple studies across various states actually show, and all my sources are on the last slide if you ever want to go read the original versions of these, but multiple sources across various states show that the highest rates of chronic absenteeisms are in high school students, which tracks, and kindergartners, which is horrifying. Children living in poverty have fewer resources to help them study, do work, or take part in extracurricular activities. Kind of hard to participate in sports if you can't afford the materials to be on the team or have a way to get home from practice. So a lot of times you've also, and we talked about this in that previous lesson where I had you watch those TikToks and the videos of the schools in Detroit, right? On top of this, it's complicated by the fact that schools in impoverished areas are often not as nice, if you will, as schools that are in more affluent areas. Why is that relevant to this conversation? Which I'd love to talk to you about if we were here, but since we're not, I'm just going to have to tell you. That's because often schools that are in impoverished areas don't have access to the supports they need, right? If you can't hire a speech language pathologist, then you can't provide those speech language, services to your students who might have speech delays. So the situation just perpetuates itself, and getting out of it becomes really, really challenging. Students who've fallen far behind academically by 4th grade and 8th grade have less than a 1 in 3% chance of being ready for college by the time they hit the end of high school. They rarely, if ever, catch up. People in poverty also often develop what's called a scarcity mindset, which can lead to making poor long-term decisions because you're more focused on the short term. So for example, let's say you have a scholarship and you are attending college, but you decide to drop out of college to work at Walmart because it pays pretty good right now. If you could somehow make it through those next 4 years of being in college, you would make double that but you can't think that far ahead because you're living under the chronic stress of, I have to survive today. Poverty also creates a sense of hopelessness, especially in situations of generational poverty where the chances of getting out of it don't even seem as if they're possible. Not that they're impossible, but obviously it's, you know what I'm trying to say. So the time you spend living in poverty during childhood, by race, if you will. This is kind of a breakdown of that. This is from the National Center for Children in Poverty. So if we're looking at total, that is the dark blue category here. Then you have your white cohort here in the green color and your African American cohort here in blue. So 71.7% of children born between 1970 and 1990. So my age. I'm at the end of it though. I was born in 89. Sorry. 71.7% of white people have never lived in poverty out of that age group. And that's people who've never been in poverty, right? Only 29.6% of Black people had that same experience, okay? When you're looking at percentage of years of your childhood spent in poverty, it kind of evens out on, people who only spent 1 to 25% of their years in poverty, but people who spent, 100% of their childhood in poverty, that's way more common among African American people. And we talked about that, right? Part of that is because systemically, whenever you were denied access to good jobs because discrimination was legal, like while our grandparents were still alive, you can't build that generational wealth that helps you accelerate yourself out of that trajectory. Time spent living in poverty by early, middle, late childhood by race. Again, you're going to notice a huge breakdown. Like, sure, it's only 14.3% of children who lived in poverty in early childhood, but disaggregate that data, 41.2% of them would have been of the African American race, which again means that we have to look at systemic issues of what's causing this, right? Exposure to poverty during childhood also leads to statistical likelihood of being poor whenever you become an adult as well, right? So if you spent, 51 to 100% of your time in poverty, where was I going? If you spent at least 8 to 14 years in poverty. I'm sorry, I can't read for some reason. I need to stop recording these. This is like the 5th one I've done in a row now. So if you spent 8 to 14 years in poverty, your proportional chance of being being poor at the age of 20, good Lord, is 40%. Right? So your numbers are much, much higher the more years you spend in poverty is what I'm trying to show from there. Anywhere you see a double asterisk there, that's just redacted data because there wasn't enough to report there. And poverty is just one of many adverse childhood experiences or ACEs that a kid can face. And if you click on this link right here, just kidding, I'm just not letting me click. Well, hello. I'm sorry, I moved my tab. Oh no, here we are. Here we go. If you click on this link right here, it will take you to basically a list of what ACEs are. Oh my gosh. And of course, it's not going to let me link, is it? No, don't resize it. Let me go to the link. Oh, the link's on the next page. I'm sorry. I just underlined it because I wanted you to see that word. God, I need to stop for the day. I'm so sorry. Anyway, moving on. I'm so sorry. Anyway, basically they impact a student's odds of success if they don't receive any support services. So there's an article on here that is going to go through and walk you through, and that's why I can't freaking click on it because it's on this slide instead. That'll talk you up through basically what counts as an adverse childhood effect. Okay. And the main reason I have this on here is because of this really super useful infographic right here. I'm scrolling and you can't even see my tab. Go figure. Here it is. But anyway, whenever you click on this, blah, 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 go down from here. You can see basically what type of things count as an adverse childhood experience. So looking at abuse, that's going to be physical, emotional, or sexual abuse. Neglect, you're looking at physical or emotional neglect. Household dysfunction include things like maybe you weren't abused, but your mother was, substance abuse in your household, divorce, mental illness, incarcerated relatives. I am going to tell you there is a quiz on here where you can take it and see what your ACEs score is. You do not have to do that. If you want to, you're more than welcome to, but you do not have to do that, okay? There is no world where I want you to have to reopen any traumatic experiences by being in this class. And like I said, I know this is a super heavy unit, but go through and at least look at that infographic of what counts as an adverse childhood experience so that you're at least familiar with that. Another adverse childhood experience that impacts many of our students is housing insecurity. And it's a very hard number to measure. I read a really interesting book. I think I have a picture of it on the next slide. Nope, I have a picture of it here. This is the book I read called There Is No Place for Us. And it was about people in Atlanta who were working and homeless. And it's a really interesting read, and I learned a ton of things from it. And the reason that we don't necessarily have an accurate number on how many people are actually homeless in America is because the national standards for what counts as homeless only counts people who are living in a shelter or living in the streets, which means if you were living out of your car, you don't count as homeless by national standards, which is ridiculous because anyone with a lick of sense would know that that would count as that. Now, the good thing is that the McKinney-Vento Act, which was passed as part of Title IX, Part A of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and it was amended later by ESSA, basically defines homelessness for students differently than the United States Census defines homelessness for people in general. So in education, we define homelessness as any student who's lacking a fixed, regular, or adequate nighttime residence. So this includes students who are living in doubled up housing. So for example, if you were to lose your home and you and your family move in with your grandparents, you would still technically count as homeless, which we might not immediately associate with homelessness, right? Because you have a home, you're going to your grandmother's home. And if your grandmother is your actual custodial parent, then in that case, you wouldn't count as homeless. But if you and your custodial parent are living with another relative, that would count as homelessness because that does add extra stress into your life. Other things that count would be living in hotels, campers, or non-permanent lodging. You would be astounded at how many people are forced to live in low budget, very dicey hotels because they can't afford rent in other places. That counts as homelessness, okay? Because even though you have a place and a roof over your head, it's not really sufficient for living a life that has a lot less stress in it. And again, if you have a chance to read that book, guys, it's phenomenal. It's nonfiction. It's a look at homelessness, but it doesn't read like a textbook. It's like true stories of actual families in Atlanta. And I didn't realize, I guess, how many people lived in hotels until I read that. Other places that count as homeless for the sake of being in education, although not for national census data, would be living in your car, a public place or an abandoned building, or any place that, as the McKinney-Vento Act quotes, wouldn't ordinarily be used as a regular sleeping location. Incidentally, if your parents kick you out and you live with somebody else, that also classifies you as homeless as well, even though there wouldn't necessarily be a measurement of that for census data. So we don't have really an accurate read of people who are actually experiencing homelessness in America because, again, the national census data is so much different. I'm going to zoom in on this so you can see it a little bit better because my eyeballs suck. So this is basically like the determination for if you fall under McKinney-Vento eligibility. So if you meet the definition of homeless by school standards. So you can kind of look through and see like, okay, are you good? If you're living in the same place every night in a safe and suspicious space, you're probably not experiencing homelessness. If you guys decided to live together for mutual benefit. So for example, if grandma moves in with you because it is easier for your parents to be able to take care of grandma, that doesn't count as being doubled up. Okay, that was a mutual decision that it's best for everybody if grandma lives with us. Now, if you move in with grandma because you've lost your home, that would count as experiencing homelessness. Obviously, if a permanently housed parent accepts a new job and you have to stay in a hotel for a week while you wait for the house to open, that doesn't count, right? Like, or if you're building a brand new house, so you're living in your RV for a month while the house is getting built, that doesn't count as experiencing homelessness because it's a temporary situation. If you have permanently moved into a hotel motel with no idea of when you're going to get out of there because that's all you can afford, that would count. Likewise, if you're living in a place that's not meant for people to live, such as a barn or a place that is not up to building code that is falling in, that counts as well. Same with living in emergency or transitional shelters. So that kind of goes through and gives you your information on how that works there. The second page is just documentation for like if you were writing down case notes on a student. You're probably never going to have to do that. And the reason I say that is because schools are required to have a person who is the McKinney-Vento liaison. And they are in charge of making sure that basically those students' needs are met. So if you have a student that you know is experiencing homelessness, it's important to report them to your McKinney-Vento liaison. Like at Vienna High School, for example, we have a social worker who is in charge of that. At my old school, it was like the school secretary, right? So it's not required that it's somebody who has experience with this. It's just required that somebody's reporting it. And surprisingly, schools with more resources have a better deal of it, which is unfortunate because often schools with more resources aren't where it's happening at as much. So again, you've got to remember that census data only reports homeless people as people who are living in shelters or streets. So whenever you're trying to get an accurate number of unhoused people in America, it's really, really challenging. And this is literally a direct quote from this book. But they have a conservative estimate, so estimating on the low side of the actual number of people that don't have housing in the United States. So those living in vehicles or hotel rooms or staying temporarily with others, along with people in shelters or on the streets, would be closer to 4 million people in America. And a lot of times they're basing that they're drawing from McKinney-Vento data and like informal surveys and things like that as well. So if you look at the census data of number of people experiencing homelessness in America, it's not actually accurate. Well, it's accurate in terms of what they count as homeless, which is not what anyone with a lick of sense would call homeless. All right, so some other terms that you need to understand. And again, I'm sorry, this is such a heavy unit. Trauma is basically your emotional response to an adverse event. Acute trauma is whenever you have been exposed to one single overwhelming event, right? So acute trauma would be like you were attacked outside once, or somebody close to you passed away, right? And I don't want you to get the idea that trauma only happens in like dysfunctional families, right? Because it can happen with two perfectly loving parents too, right? Like if you have a death of a loved one, that's a traumatic experience. And that's not something anyone can control. Chronic trauma results from whenever you were in extended exposure to traumatizing situations like poverty, domestic violence, things such as that. Complex trauma experiences it's the result of a single traumatic event that's devastating enough to have long-lasting effects, right? So what makes it different from acute trauma is like acute trauma is grandma passes away and you were trying to come to terms with that, and that is traumatic. Complex trauma is whenever there's like multiple like angles to it, right? So if you survive through a school shooting, that's going to be the trauma of being part of that school shooting. It's going to be the trauma of your classmates that have passed and things such as that. So that would be considered like complex trauma. Triggers are basically, and I hate that we use the word trigger warning so flippantly now, but a trigger would be something that triggers your brain to associate that flight or flight response that's associated with the trauma, right? So, for example, this is really common in people with PTSD. Like if you look at soldiers coming back from wars, loud sounds trigger the feeling, the fight or flight of like living through being in a war zone, right? Which is why it kind of sucks sometimes that we celebrate the 4th of July with fireworks for people who, died defending, or people who served defending that freedom. It's not an enjoyable experience for them at all. Vicarious or secondary trauma is basically the process through which your own experiences are transformed by engaging with dealing with someone else's trauma. So I know there's a decent amount of you in here that are looking at becoming social workers, for example. This is something that you will deal with, right? When you are a counselor or a social worker, you are constantly dealing with other people's trauma and compassion fatigue, right? It becomes a lot to carry everyone else's burdens. Not that fulfills us from the obligation of taking care of each other, but just be aware that it is challenging. And trauma-informed care is basically a framework of thinking that focuses on understanding traumatized individuals and connecting them with support services. So for example, if you have a young child who is acting out every single day and you are exhausted of dealing with them, you can't just simply go, oh my gosh, this is a bad kid, okay? There aren't really bad kids. There are just kids that bad things have happened to. So trauma-informed care would be going, okay, what is happening at home that is causing this kid to act like this? And how do I get them the support that they need so that they can grow past it? Trauma can have long-lasting impacts that can impact a person's chance of success. If you read that ACEs article like you were supposed to, you probably saw that the more ACEs you were exposed to, like the higher your chances of chronic illness, for example. But there are things that can be done to build resilience, to help you learn how to thrive in spite of your trauma instead of simply surviving it. So when you're looking at a trauma-informed approach for teaching students, safety is the first step. If you're looking at like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Like, which this isn't a psychology class, but hopefully you've taken one or you will at some point. But if you are not in a safe situation, we have to be there before we can deal with anything else. Trustworthiness and transparency. I always try to be really, really honest with students, including reminding them that, there are things that as a mandated reporter, I have to report if they tell me. So to, make that decision, knowing the situation that they're in. We'll talk more about mandated reporting later. Peer support, it can be extremely beneficial for students who are going through challenging situations. There's only so much you can do as an adult. Sometimes hearing from a peer is more helpful. Collaboration and mutuality, the more people you have working together, the better off it is. I am horrible at dealing with emotions. I'm not a very emotional person to begin with, and I am super freaking awkward. So I am so glad that I have a collaborative team at Vienna, basically, where I can redirect people to services with people who are actually helpful to them, which is never me. Empowerment, voice, and choice. Don't just assume that you know best for what is for a person who has been through trauma. Giving them the ability and empowering them to have agency in choosing kind of how they're going to recover can be really beneficial and healing for them. And then understanding cultural, historical, and gender issues is key as well, right? Like if you don't understand, some particular challenges that they might have faced, like for example, I always like if you're a man in this class, and I'm not trying to be like sexist here or whatever, right? Like I always talk to my husband about the fact that he was never taught to walk with his keys between his fingers so he could, hit somebody if they were attacking them. And he's like, oh my God, they tell you that as a girl? If you relate that experience to a woman, I'm pretty sure most of you are like, oh yeah, you mean you don't walk with your car keys in between your fingers? That way you could stab somebody in the eye if they came upon you on a dark street. So understanding that you might not have all of the context that you need to kind of understand complex gender issues is key as well. Resilience is basically defined as the ability to not succumb to your adverse experiences. And it's a typical response to adversity, right? So trauma doesn't take away your ability to build resilience. Resilience building skills are what help you overcome your trauma. So it's hard, right? Whenever you've been through something traumatic, but the ability to overcome that is possible. And, whether that's seeking therapy, whether that's, finding good resources, but resiliency is whenever you were able to tip the scale more towards the good, right? There's some things you can't control. You can't control necessarily if you were born with a chronic illness. You can't necessarily control if your job doesn't give you enough money to pay the bills. But if you can find people that you can count on, safe housing, those are things that tip the scale towards making life easier, which you're all doing by being in college, right? Because if you're able to find ultimate careers that will, be able to pay enough for you to survive, that will be helpful for you. So ACEs can negatively impact your physical, emotional, and social well-being, but positive childhood experiences can help buffer some of those. Do they take away trauma? God, of course not, right? But they can help you kind of go on to become healthy, fulfilling things. So positive childhood experiences are things you can provide that help a student with trauma. Being able to talk with your family about your feelings. Not everyone has that, right? Feeling like your family stood by you during difficult times. It's a good resilience builder. Not everyone has it. Participating in community traditions, right? So even if necessarily you're not coming from a family that's super supportive, finding place in like a faith community or in a volunteer civic organization can be a way to participate in those traditions and feel connected. A sense of belonging in high school can make a huge difference. If you don't feel like you have a place in your school, that makes school a little bit more challenging, right? And if you haven't found a club to connect with and you are still in high school, I highly recommend finding something to connect with. You can always join my speech team. Kidding. But if you're teaching in a school, it's really important to find ways to connect kids, right? And like I joke about my speech team all the time, but like I recognize that's not for everyone. But I try to do a survey at the beginning of the year where I figure out what kids are connected to things and what they would be connected to. Like if they're not in any clubs, what would they want to be in? Because if you can find an outlet for everyone, that's more likely to contribute to that chance of feeling like you belong. Feeling supported by your friends. Friends don't support you, find better friends. Having at least 2 non-parent adults who take a genuine interest in you also makes a huge difference. And as a parent, that's a struggle for me, right? Because I want to be everything for my kids. But knowing that they need to have people in their lives who aren't me, who are adults, is important. And feeling safe and protected by an adult in your home, of course, can be a positive childhood experience too. Whereas for some of these, with the family ones particularly, obviously, some of those contribute to being ACEs. And the more positive childhood experiences a child has, the more likely they are to be healthy and resilient. And there's a lot of things we can offer in school that help students overcome these, whether it's after school care and a safe place to stay, whether it's take home meals because their family might not have, food in the house at home, whether it's just being the adult that a kid can connect to when they're having problems. There are all sorts of things you can do that don't necessarily cost any money. But being the supportive person in a kid's life, it's important. And I'm going to be honest, you're not going to be able to connect every kid, right? That's why it is so important to have a team of people. There are kids who, despite my best effort, do not like me. And I get that I'm not for everyone. I wouldn't want to hang out with me either. But I try to connect with as many kids as I can in the hopes that maybe I can be that person for someone. And if I can't be that person for someone, the next thing I try to do is figure out what person could, right? Connect them to someone. So here's my overall sources. I'm sorry again for the extremely heavy content that we had to go through here, but unfortunately, you're going to find that a whole lot of your kids are coming to you with, especially if you stay in rural Southern Illinois. There's a lot of poverty and there's a lot of challenges that this area faces. It's hard, but the work is worth doing, guys, because whenever you see a student who makes it through and they become the first in their family to graduate high school, or the first in their family to not go to jail, or the first in their family to graduate college, guys, it's so rewarding and you can make that difference. I had a really good childhood growing up. So like but like I was a first generation college student, right? I had no idea what the flip I was doing. I didn't know how to go to college. No one in my family knew how to go to college. But on that positive childhood experience list, right? I had non-parent adults who went, you're smart enough to go through college and I'm going to drag you kicking and screaming through it. And honestly, it's thanks to my teachers that I made it through. Like, did I have my parents' support? Yeah, right. Like, I mean, they told me they were going to kill me if I dropped out of college. They weren't actually going to kill me, to be clear. Metaphorically, not literally, right? But they weren't able to help me, right? So because I had teachers who took an interest in me, I was able to go through and finish college. And now I'm here teaching college, which is wild. I would have never dreamed that when I was 17. So just know that you can make all the difference in a kid's life. And it is our job to try to do that as much as possible. So even when your students are being challenging, always remember, why are we in the situation we're in? What can I do to help? And if I can't be the one to help, who can I connect them to so that they can be helped? So, like I said, sorry for the long and heavy lesson, but hopefully it was full of things that you might find useful someday. Or hopefully that you get to work with people who have never had problems. They don't exist, guys. All right. If you've got questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I am happy to help. Looking forward to hearing from you soon.